Through my years of uncertainty and depression, I found that shame hung around like a bad smell, its crushing presence behind me at every turn, sinking into my skin and itching deep inside my belly. I grew up in a Christian household. We were very active in the church when I was a child, well into my teens. On the surface, there was this mediocre acceptance of my sexuality and gender identity within the church. But it quickly became too traumatizing and isolating for me. And when I was about 18, I completely separated myself from Christianity. I held this great shame about my queerness for a long time, and it grew into a wild beast. It has been years of effort to find my own spirituality and people who will actually love me unconditionally, not make false promises under the guise of control and condemnation. My shame in my teenage years left my self-image and mental well-being in tatters. Dysphoria and dysmorphia creates a particularly toxic cocktail for any child. When I was 17, I had finally found a label for my gender identity which resonated well, and found the courage to come out to my parents. That was the year my father was diagnosed with cancer. The time in which I cared for and watched him deteriorate, my identity went on the back burner. How shameful of me to deal with such trivial things while I watched him die. I vividly remember sitting on the couch, watching over him lying in the hospital bed, in our living room when he finally passed. I hold many regrets from that time, but the one real regret I have was never coming out to him. My young adulthood has been a journey of finding myself again. Through my work at A Gender Agenda, my studies in queer theory, and support from my close family and friends, I have found true passion for working to advocate for and support the LGBTIQ+ community. I have found this amazing, constantly emerging support system within my own community. When I was 13, I didn't think I would live to see 18. My passion working with youth is driven by wanting to make sure that every young person I work with never needs to feel like that. Or, even if they do, they will never be unsupported and unloved. Throughout my life, my mother has been my rock. She inspires me continuously to do this work and allow myself to not burn out. I have found that rather allowing this great monster to loom behind me at every moment, there is this beautiful harmony in embracing and even celebrating what made me feel shameful. For me, queerness is anarchy. It is strength and taking control. It's a rejection of those who tried to reject me, and I can't wait to see what comes next.
Barbary started showing up at the cafe like a cat without a home. I had opened the cafe earlier that year, and from the start it attracted swarms of women. My wife Tessa and I hosted discussions, film screenings, book launches, dances, art classes, fundraisers, and many women's groups. Without meaning to, we summoned the lesbians of Melbourne to our little patch of paradise on Sydney Road, Brunswick. "Why do you call your cafe lesbian and not queer?" was the first thing Barbary asked me. "Because lesbians need somewhere to go to," I replied. She grinned. Soon enough, all of Barbary's lesbian friends started showing up. There was Artie and her partner Jean, brilliant activists who had found each other later in life. There was Claudia, a self-defense teacher throughout the 80s. There were all the young lesbian feminists, and of course there was Chris. Chris had spent her youth as a lesbian separatist on Amazon Acres, aka the Women's Land. At one film screening, she presented the crowd with a picture of a canvas shelter in a bushy clearing, proudly exclaiming, "I lived under that tarp for 3 years." Chris has the best stories, in which you can never quite tell fact from fiction. Bringing the old and young lesbian feminist communities together was exciting. We organised, we wrote books, And then in August we were invited to visit the Women's Land for their October gathering. "We're all dying," said Artie. "We need younger women to take it over." The first night that Tessa and I arrived was a full moon. 40 old women sat around the fire, laughing and sharing stories. Suddenly we heard whispers of a talent competition, and a performance list was handed around for the brave to add their names to. Tessa and I hosted a spontaneous, intergenerational lesbian quiz of modern dating terms. "Okay, now I need 3 older volunteers to take a seat here." I gestured to the seats I'd set out in front of the group. When they were seated, Tessa began. "Can anyone tell me what ghosting is?" The look of bewilderment on our volunteers' faces was enough to set the crowd into hysterics. "I know," called out Margot. "It's when the ghost of your dead mother follows you around, telling you what to do." Geez, that's deep. "Okay, does anyone know what a gold star is?" Chris replied, "Is it when you write your lover a letter and put a gold star in the envelope?" "Okay, who wants to take a guess at what breadcrumbing might be?" That night we stayed up dancing by the fire. The following days were full of bushwalks, tours of dwellings, chainsaw workshops and ukulele jams. The final night I sat by the fire staring out at the mountains and stars overhead. I felt the women before me, the energy of songs and cooking and working and organising and writing the world in a way that it had never been written before. It's easy to see how so many women got lost here. We returned to the cafe and to life in Melbourne, but it was never the same. My heart is as wide as the ocean. I had seen women living for themselves, not families, not children, not husbands. Women with weathered hands and booming voices, teaching younger ones to chop wood and wield a chainsaw, holding space in a way that society rarely grants ageing women. Though Tessa and I made the difficult decision to sell the cafe, our community remains strong. We regularly visit Amazon Acres and have a commitment to keeping it alive for future generations of women to enjoy. The intergenerational friendships are well forged, with some touching relationships between young and old. Some women now live together, some work together, and we meet for political actions, land gatherings and celebrations. As for Tessa and I, our world is now exponentially bigger and more meaningful. We've learned to take risks because life is short. And with each other and our sisterhood, we know that we will always land on our feet. How exceptionally, beautifully, wonderfully God made you. I got used to believing that love is no use. I got used to telling myself that I'm just a fool until you. Until you, until you,
I escaped a country town and my abusive family at 15 and landed in Canberra, where I discovered Doonas. Homelessness led me deep into activism and I learned lots about community development and political engagement. 5 years later, I was facilitating a men's group as a volunteer and training young men to run workshops about domestic violence, incest and sexual assault. Jim from Uri Street came to a bunch of these workshops, and pretty soon we were having long conversations about sex, gender and politics. When the men's group began to look at issues of sexuality and identity, another group formed, and we published a zine called The Flying Faggot. This was influenced by the work of the Radical Fairies and interesting others. Around this time, the AIDS pandemic was hitting hard in Australia, and people were dying. Jim was recruiting people who had experience working with sexuality and identity. Beginning with the AIDS Education Mobile Unit, which was also one of the first needle exchanges, I went on to work on projects about HIV and AIDS in the youth sector, about things like HIV and homeless youth and prisoners, and for the new AIDS Action Council on men who have sex with men who inject drugs, on beats, and working with sex workers. Then I was asked to assist with setting up a local chapter of a US organisation, the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, and to establish ACT UP Australia. ACT UP was huge and used a model that drew people together on things they agreed with, and this meant we didn't need to have worked out every aspect of our allies' political positions on other stuff. It was basic coalitionism. We also used a technique of simply asking people with AIDS what they wanted and then delivering that. ACT UP did things that were controversial. We were extremely public-facing. At times we were borderline illegal and often definitely naughty. We were willing to be scary while also having meetings with ministers and big pharma reps. We listened and built community, and this dramatically altered the public face of the crisis. I was a participant in the establishment of the National People Living with AIDS Coalition, NIPPLWAC, which was a unique development in community health. We changed the game. We mostly got what we demanded on behalf of people living with AIDS. The AIDS crisis wasn't ended, but treatment options were transformed and the suicide rate declined. This was just before Queer came to Australia, and that was in part a response to escalating violence targeting gay men and transsexual people. ACT UP laid the foundations that allowed a group of us to grab hold of the possibilities Queer offered. Beginning with distributing the Queer Nation publications from the US, we used tactics that scared the closeted leadership of the mainstream gay movement of the time. They didn't like us at all. Radical inclusive sexuality as an organising principle had an extraordinary, immediate impact. Queer outlived Queer Nation in remarkable and fabulous ways.
I'm inspired by people's relationship with place. I'm fascinated with the way culture shapes landscape. In recent times, I've become increasingly concerned about the lack of sheroes in our cityscapes and our disconnect from place. I asked people, women, queer folk, how they felt about the city. They told me they didn't feel safe alone at night. Settling for self-imposed curfew rather than take a risk or pay more to secure their safety. Even when they got there, they said there was no there for them. We want stories about Indigenous people and women, unique stories only the locals know, to get the inside scoop on where to go in the city at night, to access the spirit of place and find the city's character, they said. All the gender paradoxes started piling up in my brain and I felt like I was going to explode. I knew women are the major consumers of art and culture. Women are the largest producers of art and culture. Women make up the highest proportion of arts workers. And the highest gender pay gap in Australia is in our creative industries. None of this has changed in years. When will it end? I screamed. If cultural change leads structural change, we're going nowhere. But damn it, Australian women were the first in the world to gain full suffrage. I said to my partner, let's start an arts active tourism service. We can lead night walks, cycle rides around the street, telling stories. You know, the ones you rarely see in our public institutions and public spaces. We can do it together, in our third age. We mobilise partners, artists, local historians, filmmakers, poets and dancers. We scoured the nation's collections, looking for works to show cultural and environmental change. We rubbed our magic lantern and made a wish, and Shazam! A genie emerged. Local genie, an arts and social enterprise casting light on people and their stories of place. Since then, we've led lots of night walks for hundreds of people, revealing hidden narratives. Shiro's stories about the nurses who have fought pandemics here since 1911. Artpreneurs like Verity Hewitt, whose independent bookshop provided a pool of light to Canberra's book-starved community in the 1930s. Feminists who changed themselves to the public bar and demanded a drink at the Civic Hotel in the 1960s, and more. Night walking in cities is about going astray. Dig in. What's amiss where you stand?
Born in 1963, I was never comfortable in my body. I used to push my penis back in and be disappointed when it didn't stay there. I went through cycles of cross-dressing and purging during my teens and 20s. In the early 90s, I read an article about gender dysphoria and realised that that was what I felt, and the treatment was possible. There wasn't much support back then. My then GP didn't want to know. Only one psychiatrist in Canberra accepted patients with gender dysphoria. I had to go to Sydney for endocrinology and beard electrolysis, and so on. Eventually, I started on hormones. I had to transition sooner than planned because my body took to hormones like, and I couldn't hide my boobs anymore. I refinanced my house to afford gender affirmation surgery in the US. It was what I needed to relieve my dysphoria. A couple years later, my brain chemistry spun me into depression and anxiety disorder. But at least I didn't have gender dysphoria. I spent 2 decades in varying depths of depression. Sometimes I could work, sometimes I couldn't, and I'd have to fight Centrelink for support. They finally granted me a disability support pension, and my anxiety started easing as soon as I had enough money to live on. After a 20-year drought, I wanted to make up for lost time and started dating. I once said to a therapist that I'd rather be a tomboy than a sissy, but I'd really prefer not to have to choose. Turns out I had the right idea. I just didn't know about non-binary back then. I feel about 20% masculine to 80% femme, so my pronouns remain she and her. Sometimes I'm comfortable in jeans and a t-shirt, sometimes in a pretty dress, makeup and jewellery, the full catastrophe. I've always had friendships with some sexual tension. I knew I was bisexual back in the 90s, but now pansexual better fits my thinking. There's little difference in practice. I look straight to an outsider because all my partners are masculine presenting, but that's just a coincidence. Yes, partners, plural. I'm polyamorous. My love is like the magic pudding. The more I give away, the more there is of it. Specifically, I'm solo poly. I love having my own space that I don't have to share. My partners live elsewhere, but we see each other regularly. Now I know I'm loved and I'm alive!
Jacquie in our hometown. So take me, come along, the man I love. I think I'll be awake a long time.
Well, that's it. I'm nearly 70 years old. Just saying that's a shock. It's true what they say. Inside every old person is a young person wondering what the hell happened. So I thought I'd share a bit of my coming of a certain age story. In June 1978, we had a morning street march from the Cross to Taylor Square with a whole bunch of friends who were part of the Gay Solidarity Group. We marched again that night for Out of the Bars and Into the Streets, an event that became very scary when we were confronted by the police. Well, that was a watershed moment in the founding of the Sydney Gay and Lesbian Mardi Gras, and we've since become known as the 78ers. After graduating from university, I joined a theatre company called Pippi Storm, and we toured to Western Australia in 1980. Oh, Perth in the 80s. It was so much fun. I had a busy public life as a performer, jazz singer, part of the festival fringe scene. I worked at Murdoch and Curtin universities teaching there, and I was the events manager at the Film and Television Institute, and I was the lead singer in an all-girl band called Tokyo Rose. When I think of a time in my life, it usually comes with a soundtrack. And after performing 21 shows at the 1984 Adelaide Festival Fringe, Tokyo Rose's fame spread to Canberra, where our song, I Hate the Police, became a hit on community radio 2XX.
I hate the police, I hate the police, and the bourgeoisie, and the bourgeoisie. I hate them, and I hate me.
In the 90s, I moved to Canberra. I performed at Tilly's and the ANU with a few bands, including the Aram Lilies. I performed at the Meridian Club, and I created several characters, namely Bête Noire, Jacquie, One Size Fits All, and a drag queen, Carmen Farkme. In 1991, I was one of a group of Canberra-based LGBTQI+ artists who put together a collection of works as Canberra Gays for exhibition in that year's Mardi Gras program in Queanbeyan and Sydney. My performance piece was called Tales of Ordinary Gayness. I declared Queanbeyan the cultural hub of the Monaro, and I nominated myself as the lesbian superstar. I released a version of Que Sera on 2XX that year, and it was in the charts for 12 weeks and reached number 1. Well, imagine my surprise when my mother's friend Edna commented that she'd heard me on 2XX, and she asked me to sing the song for her.
I said, Mama, I made a choice, and it don't include no time for boys. I'm a lesbian, I'm a dyke, I'm gay. Just have to love me this way, 'cause I'm happy. Believe that. Mama sighed, looked at me long and said, you've always been headstrong, you're gay, okay, or tear up high. Whoever said a woman needs a guy, you get by. I love you. Can you believe that?
As the lesbian superstar from Queanbeyan, I performed regularly in Sydney and Melbourne during the early 90s, where I had the opportunity to share the stage with such icons as the Top Twins, Sue-Ann Post and Deborah Cheetham. It was also a great thrill to be asked to MC the opening concert for the 1992 Lesbian Festival in Melbourne at the Myer Music Bowl. Such great times. And now, as I look in and look out, reflecting on how much the world has changed with respect to our rights around gender and sexuality, diversity and inclusiveness, legislative change in Australia will drive social and behavioural change. I hope that no child will have to deal with the fear of being outcast or punished for their difference. No more 78. Hooray. And I'm still performing, but quietly. So maybe it's not such an ordinary life.